Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome to the ICA. My name is Stephen Cairns. I'm Curator of Artist Film and Moving Image here at ICA. It's a great pleasure to have you all here this evening and to be hosting this Stuart Hall Foundation discussion event. I have some housekeeping for you. The conversation is recorded this evening and any questions that anyone asks will be recorded. Our speakers are being live streamed. So that's recorded as well. So any questions will be captured through the live stream. I believe afterwards the discussion will be available to watch online, so please recommend to your friends. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Julian Henriques, who is a trustee of Stuart Hall Foundation, who's going to introduce our event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much for coming. I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of the Stuart Hall Foundation to this evening's discussion, Stuart Hall in the here and now. And there's several other trustees here in the audience. I won't name them, but I'm very happy that we're at the ICA. Basically, the whole point of the Stuart Hall Foundation is to take the inspiration of Stuart's work and to support new generations of creative thinkers and provoke original thinking, debate and research. And the foundation seeks to illuminate connections between politics, culture and society and to challenge the status quo. And so the idea of conversations and indeed of collective work is very important for us. And so tonight, on our theme of Stuart Hall here and now, we will definitely have time for conversation after you've heard from the panelists. And that's very important because as a foundation, we see our job as really making use of Stuart Hall's work in the present, in the here and now, as I keep saying, rather than only preserving it. And I think that's very important because if anything, Stuart was totally involved with all his work and purposed all his work in terms of what he called famously the conjuncture. And if we ever needed a conjuncture, we've got one right now. Right? And so we'll be dealing with that. We're taking the occasion of the publication of the 2 volumes of the essential essays edited by my friend and colleague David Morley on my right as the opportunity to engage with the work and to indeed make use of it. And I'd just like to add that we're very happy to be in the ICA because, I mean, the ICA for actually many decades has been a home for radical thinking, radical black thinking. And I just, from my bookshelves, I found the Identity, the Real Me, 87, right, edited by Homi Bhabha. And then The Fact of Blackness about the Frantz Fanon conference that was here. That was published as a book in '96. And then, of course, the ICA screened John O'Comfor's film, The Stuart Hall Project. And indeed, the foundation had an event just after Christmas here where we screened It Ain't Half Racist, Mum, in conjunction with the London Short Film Festival. And so we feel really very much at home here. And I hope that everyone in the audience will also feel at home here. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I have to introduce myself first. I'm Julian Henriques. I have a job in the Media, Communications and Cultural Studies Department of Goldsmiths University, where, among other things, I teach an MA in Cultural Studies and also one in script writing. And okay, so that's, I think, as much as I want to say, apart from actually introducing the panelists. What we're going to do is, first of all, well, I'll introduce them one by one. So Dave Morley is Professor of Communications at Goldsmiths with me and co-editor with me, actually, of Stuart Hall, Conversations, Projects and Legacies, which the Goldsmiths Press brought out last year. And among many other books, Stuart Hall, Critical Dialogues in Cultural Studies, which was published in '97. So you're going to hear first from Dave, who's going to, as the editor of the book, to give a bit of an overview in the beautiful, I must say, introductions that you provided already in the book, which I had occasion, of course, to read very recently. And then after after that, immediately on my and Dave's right, Professor Angela McRobbie, who is also a professor in our same Media Communications and Cultural Studies Department, and a fellow of the British Academy. Her most recent books are The Aftermath of Feminism, Be Creative, Making a Living in the New Cultural Industries, and Feminism and the Politics of Resilience. And so what I asked the panelists to do was to pick out one or two of the essays in the collected edition, which you can see very beautifully arranged right in front of you there on the table, to pick one or two of the essays to concentrate on for their quite brief introductions. And Angela's going to be talking about the notes on deconstructing the popular and the great moving right show. And so that you'll hear from Angela first, and then you'll hear from Roshini. Roshini Kempadoo is a media artist and photographer and reader at the University of Westminster. She creates artworks that interpret and reimagine contemporary and historical experiences of the particular and the everyday. She evokes women's stories and perspectives through fictional writing, photographs, recording, music, interactivity, and networked environments. Her recent publications include Creole in the Archive in 2016. And Roshini is going to talk about deconstructing identities, old and new, and the post-colonial and the diaspora when she comes to her part. And then finally, the last panelist is Dr. Clive James Nwonka. He's at LSE and a fellow in film studies in the Department of Sociology. His work explores issues of realism, racism, class, architecture, and representation in British and American cinema, and diversity policy in the British film and TV industries. He convenes a course in widescreen black images and the sociology of black cinema on the MSc Culture and Society programme. His book, The Aesthetics of British Urban Cinema, is to be published next year by Bloomsbury. Brilliant. Okay, and Clive is going to talk about old and new identities and old and new ethnicities, and what is black in black popular culture. Right? Okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful, but I've got all my introductions out of the way, which is great. Now we can get on to the meat of it. So you'll hear 10 or 12 minutes from Dave, 10 minutes or less from each of the panelists. We'll have a quick... I know, basically the conversation, this is all for the good of the conversation at the end, right? And then we'll have a little to and fro, so to speak, between the panelists, and then it'll be your turn about 7:30 for at least half an hour for some discussion. So I hope that's not too much information when you go. So Dave, can I give you the mic?
Thank you, Julian. Is that not working? Left or right? 1, 2. Okay, well, despite Julian's stress. Is it working?
Close to your mouth.
Huh?
Close to your mouth.
Yeah. Well, despite Julian's stress on the here and now, I actually want to go back a little bit and say some things of a more general nature about the influence and potential uses of Stuart's work. I want to focus not so much on what Stuart did or said, but how he did it, his methodology, to use a grandiose phrase, and how we might learn from that. But in saying that, we also have to know how difficult it is to learn anything from the past. I think there's an exemplary rendition of that issue in the publicity for Nick Beach's forthcoming event on policing the crisis, when he quotes Stuart on how very carefully you have to disinter Gramsci's comments on regional culture in Sardinia from their original context if you're going to try and transplant them elsewhere. It's not a cut and paste job. Today has many resonances for me. 20 years ago, I took part in another launch event for a book of essays by and about Stuart called Critical Dialogues in Cultural Studies, here. And one of the reviewers remarked in a jocular, but I think telling aside, that anyone writing a novel about the British intellectual left in the post-war period might well find themselves spontaneously reinventing a figure exactly like Stuart Hall. So much of his personal narrative and the public history of 20th century Britain being intertwined, at once both deeply symbiotic and sharply at odds. All these years later, I find that remark still resonates. The question of Stuart's influence today can usefully be related, I think, to his conception of how cultural power operates. He had a particular interest in how systems of hegemony work almost invisibly through their capacity to set the limits of common sense and thus the horizons of thought in a given period. They do this by establishing certain propositions to be so self-evidently true that they don't have to be stated explicitly. They literally go without saying. The ideological twist here, of course, as Stuart said, is that while common sense always presents itself as natural and timeless, its actual contents are radically changeable over time. To take one example, not quite random, in the early 70s, monetarism was an obscure and much derided bit of specialist economic theory. A decade later, it had become the taken for granted common sense of Thatcherism. And today, it still provides the intellectual rationale for the assumed necessity to reduce the national deficit, a presumption which has condemned us all to the austerity politics of the last 10 years. Now, while I'd certainly regard Stuart's influence on things as considerably more benign than that of monetarism, I still want to propose a formal analogy insofar as in both cases, the influence is so profound that it becomes almost invisible. His work has had certainly a transformative effect on the common sense of many academic disciplines, which have now undergone a cultural turn, as they say, in so many different. Nowadays, it goes without saying that issues of culture and representation are as important as questions of economics, that we must pay attention not only to class, but to questions of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, and that our very definition of the field of the political must be extended to include its popular and vernacular forms. However, if all that now seems to be no more than common sense, hardly worth saying, that is precisely because work like Stuart's has made it so. Having said that, let me turn to the books. My most difficult task as the editor of those essential essays was that of finalizing the selection of a plausibly representative sample from the vast range of Stuart's essays. My priority was to situate them in the context of the conjunctural debates to which they were variously contributed. I've also been concerned to highlight the continuities that underlay them. If Stuart always wanted to push his argument forward, he was nonetheless opposed to any simple model of intellectual progress and was also concerned, as he put it, to honour his intellectual debts to the positions he was trying to transcend. Let me just mention some of those continuities, which become increasingly apparent the more I reread essays, sometimes written 30 or 40 years apart. One was the continuing influence of his early training in literary methods of analysis and his insistence on the necessity of close attention to the text, an approach derived from scholars such as F.R. Leavis. Indeed, while he entirely rejected Leavis's politics, he was still at pains to recognise his moral seriousness, a quality which informs Stuart's own abiding concern with questions of aesthetic and cultural value. He had no time for the uncritical celebration of popular culture. Rather, Stuart aimed for the decanonisation of the established categories alongside the retention of the critical function. What also became clearer to me in the editing process was the extent to which concerns with race and ethnicity already informed his earliest work, so that even when he's ostensibly talking about class, he's usually doing so from a diasporic perspective. Conversely, it was his critique of conventional Marxism's deterministic models of class which provided what Cobbin and Mercer described as the architectonic grounding enabling his later deconstruction of essentialist models of race and ethnicity. From what I've heard of it, it seems that the recently opened archive of Stuart's files at the Cadbury Research Library in Birmingham will throw quite a lot more light on those interconnections. Another striking continuity I found was how Stuart's analyses of the recomposition of the class structure in the affluent societies of the 1950s already laid the conceptual groundwork for his later work on the emergent consumer cultures of the new times of post-Fordism and then of neoliberalism. What also became clearer, the longer I was immersed in the essays, was how much right from his time in Oxford, Stuart had always been engaged with Marxism from outside its Eurocentric presumptions. He notes almost all the group to which he belonged were from the ex-colonies, and we see a glimpse right at the beginning of the hybrid origins of what came to be called British cultural studies. It was that perspective which provided the intellectual basis from which he went on to produce his later critique of ethnocentric perspectives on globalization. His Marxism was always decentered by his liminal perspective as a marginal native, or as Bill Schwartz's book title has it, a familiar stranger in the West. Nonetheless, the central concerns of Marxism were never far away. How changes in the mode of production relate to changes in socio-political formations, how to provide a historical perspective on present-day events. To the end, he remained deeply concerned with questions of periodization, though we find him already posing them, if in a rather different vocabulary, as early as 1958, when he asks in A Sense of Classlessness, where does the old end? Where does the new, the really new, not the superficially new, begin? He would never, of course, have claimed to have a definitive answer to any such question. His was always a more modest search for provisional truths. However, it was a search conducted in the utmost seriousness, if accompanied by a wry chuckle at the most intellectually challenging moments. But that chuckle was no incidental mannerism. I think David Scott is right to point us towards Fanon's observation that the quality of a man is to be found not simply in his acts, but in the ethos of his intellectual style. In Stuart's case, the conviviality of his particular style was manifested not simply in what he did himself, but also in what he enabled so many others to do, and thus can enable us to do today. But to return to my beginning on the question of resonances, there are so many, as Julian said. I think it was the ICA publication Black Film and British Cinema which first saw the publication of the New Ethnicities paper. And today, the relative optimism of that moment has obviously receded as we see all kinds of xenophobias around us now re-legitimized by contemporary political discourse. But at least Trump is in Portsmouth today and not with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David Morley. So we'll go straight on with Angela McRobbie. Do you want this mic? I think you have one there.
Yeah, I'll just figure out how to hold the mic. My pen down here and read very fast. And put my glasses on, sorry, as well. How does that sound okay? Yeah. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here tonight. The ICA in the 1980s was a place of stimulating and provocative dialogue, and I was fortunate to take part with Stuart in many of these occasions. Our current times and exceptional predicaments make a return to some of Stuart's seminal essays from 30 years ago all the more pressing. I'd also like to thank Dave Morley for such judicious editing, crafting the articles so that they're faithful to Stuart's capacity to produce intellectual work, which is also such a good read. Although Notes on Deconstructing the Popular appeared in 1981, 2 years after the Great Moving Right show, it makes sense to comment on its relevance and importance first, because it fleshes out in more detail some of the issues at stake in the politics of culture and the dangers of populism in what has since transpired to be the very long moment of Thatcherism. This is a tightly argued piece, with Stuart Hall responding to various ongoing debates in the left and in radical sociology, as well as cultural studies, about class and the place of popular culture in the politics of resistance. One can almost hear various other voices resonating on the edges of the text. It's also a piece of writing where Stuart Hall shows his interest in those attempts within the power bloc to address the people in terms of their best interests as part of a bid to undertake specific transformations of society. There are a number of key themes we can extract from this paper to help us understand the here and now. And so I'm going to itemize what is the most salient features of this article for today. First of all, Hall's idea of popular culture emphasizes culture as a site of struggle, where there is a constant power battle to articulate vernacular elements. And I noticed that Dave used the word vernacular, and I want to come back to what do we mean by vernacular, these vernacular elements might once have belonged to dominated classes, so that they are, however, transformed into quiescent or socially conservative values, coming together under the rubric of Britishness and our way of life. Hall refers to how and where this struggle in and for culture happens as a constant repeated feature of everyday life. And he points to the special role of the popular press, quote, organized by capitalism, quote, a force of dominant cultural production with, quote, the power to represent the class to itself in its most traditionalist form. And in drawing attention to the colloquial vocabulary of the Sun, for example, we are reminded too of Hall's frequent attention to the language, the idioms, the syntax, and the phraseology found in the Murdoch-owned newspaper. Likewise, Hall refers to Coronation Street's ability to rework the interior contradiction of feeling and perception in the dominated classes. We see Hall move toward the second feature of the article, I would argue, the second salient point, is that we see Hall here move towards a theory of the constitutive power of language to bring into being that of which it speaks. That is, that the popular classes are constituted, made and shaped by media forms such as the Sun or the Daily Mirror, through what Hall refers to as its linguistic ventriloquism. This is a form of what we might call class making. This ventriloquism can reshape popular elements, as Stuart Hall puts it, quote, into a species of canned and neutralized demotic populism. What could be more relevant than that today? So there is this idea of the relations of force tapping into residual or traditional elements, themselves always unstable, and rearranging them, realigning them to comply with the new order of the national popular. Third point in the paper, there is here a theory of the cultural power of linking or articulation at the basis of this paper. The microphysics of cultural power is understood as requiring a constant labor of arranging and rearranging signs, language, terms, and phrases. If there is something seemingly inexorable about the forces of the right at work in the wider cultural field, delinking and rearticulating elements to produce new popular constituencies, we can also surmise that Hall sees this work of assembling as necessary for the left. This raises the question today, how can a new radical popular vernacular be established? What forms would it take? What might be its relation to tradition? What is the status of tradition in Brexit Britain? I'm now going to say a few words about the Great Moving Right Show and then quickly conclude. Rereading this article, it becomes an even more incredible piece of writing from 40 years ago, providing the most sophisticated and complex analysis of those forces amassing and taking shape as the Great Moving Right show. Hall insists on its deeper roots and longer duration than just the moment of Thatcherism. He mentions Enoch Powell at the start and comes back to him later, saying that although many argued that Powellism had lost and it had been drowned out in opposition, in fact, considerable victories had already accrued around his interventions. It licensed the forging of a series of, quote, magical connections between race, immigration control, and images of nation, the British people, and the threat to our way of life. Prescient indeed. This swing to the right takes place, and we're thinking here in 1979, this swing to the right takes place with the left in a weak position. And Hall here upgrades the left in a way that at the time, I recall, and subsequently made him quite unpopular amongst various factions. He claimed that the right appeared to have all the good ideas. This didn't mean he also thought them good ideas, but they were couched in catchy phrases and things, they were referring to things that had a common sense ring to them. The key thing then is to understand this shift towards authoritarian populism and how this new radical right regime had come into being as Thatcher managed to produce a more polarized society. And he makes two key points here. Trouncing the wets of the Tories and also the middle ground of social democracy or liberal democracy, i.e. what Hall describes as the evacuation of the centrists. This then unleashed a more forceful right wing, which Hall said had been previously kept in reins. This analysis speaks even more clearly in the here and now. Hall understands Thatcher as promoting with stark clarity what he calls neoliberal doctrine, which is summed up by Hall as anti-statist and anti-collectivist. Let me quote, "This transformation of a theoretical ideology into a populist idiom was a major political achievement, turning a hard-edged economic rationality into a compulsive moralism." And I want to return to the idea of moralism. The moralism then finds expression in the tabloid press and has carried on since then unhindered. Hall talks about how the right scorned welfare state coddling, and the word coddling has certain connotations, creating a society of handouts. And of course, the phrase handouts is still so much in the air. By the mid-1970s, he claims, it was not uncommon to encounter various phrases which are nowadays, 2019, also so prevalent, such as welfare state scroungers. So, the long duration indeed. In effect, this has meant transforming elements of working class interests into questions of British identity. And Hall argues that this did the work of producing populist political subjects, thanks to a national crusade, another quote, which I was astounded when I read it again, to make Britain great once more, as Hall puts it. It's not, claims Hall, that people are so malleable, more that political effectivity here rests on being able to address real material and often contradictory interests. She, Mrs. Thatcher, he says, brought them over. So let me finish by bringing things up to date and to locate Hall posthumously within our here and now. So many questions come to the fore. The relation between the acute diagnostics of contemporary neoliberalism and the neo-nationalisms of today, indeed new forms of fascism. Hall warns against a too easy use of the word fascism back then in 1979, instead saying that we had to understand with more complexity the dynamics of authoritarian populism. He praised the actions of the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism. He acknowledged the threat of the National Front and, of course, that of Enoch Powell, but he concentrates on dissecting the new radical right without its links to neo-fascist groupings. This stance continues throughout Hall's writing, right up until the final articles on a common sense of neoliberalism with Alan O'Shea. Here too we see fine detailed attention to vernacular expressions, such as those invented by the heads of communication and the speechwriters of the Tory party. Sleeping off a life on benefits being a term that George Osborne, which Hall refers to, used to drive as big a wedge as possible between, another quote, the strivers and the skivers. Here too we see the role of popular morality as the favoured rhetorical device of the tabloid press, casting welfare dependency as immoral, indecent. This is a trope which has justified the austerity rationale of neoliberal government now for the last decade, but which was already fully formed and in place back then. Right, I'm just about to finish. Not long ago, Alice Weidel of the German neo-fascist party, the AfD, said that Mrs. Thatcher was her role model. This prompted on my own part a set of questions as to how far right the Iron Lady herself envisaged British society as moving. Even with Hall's analysis of authoritarian populism and Paul Gilroy's constant warnings about white supremacy, nevertheless, perhaps as a sign of my own general optimism, this felt like perhaps even an insult to the Iron Lady. Possibly my kindness to Mrs. Thatcher is here misplaced. But it does raise the question of what we might call conjunctural unthinkables. Back then, at the end of the 70s, although racist violence was prevalent and the National Front skinheads were carrying out day-to-day attacks on Black and Asian Britons, actually including my own house in Selly Oak in Birmingham, where we got bricks through the window, as I recall, really existing fascism nevertheless felt like a distant thing, perhaps for the reason that we were then conjunctural subjects of peacetime. We were, if you like, peaceniks, and what we understood as the defeat of fascism, if not of US white supremacy. As an electoral force, neo-fascist groupings in the UK seemed relatively insignificant. And as Stuart Hall implies, so deep were the roots of social conservatism across British society that perhaps this played an immunizing effect. In this respect, I take from Stuart a pessimism, actually, about the chances for the left, even though his own demeanour always managed to convey, Dave said, conviviality, and I say a joie de vivre. Someone who believed in peace, i.e. I see Stuart as a peacenik, and consequently one who worked towards the reduction of violence in everyday life, on the street and in the debating chamber. This did not stop him from taking on any number of adversaries, as many of us will recall, including the BBC, when he made the programme It Ain't Half Racist, Mum. To sum up, Hall was also a conjunctural subject of Windrush post-war times. In my view, he comes across as a welfare socialist, as well as a scathing critic of social democracy and the Labour Party in office. My recent rereading of Hall suggests that he did not endorse a left-wing populism, such as that argued for by Chantal Mouffe, and instead he looked to a politics of alliances and of left pluralisms, as well as expressing some faith in multicultural vernaculars and in the popular arts as sites for the rearticulation of meaning. And for me, that was most richly expressed in Stuart's work and his comments on films like My Beautiful Laundrette, Isaac Gilliam's equally prescient films such as Young Soul Rebels and Looking for Langston, and also his immersion in the world of the Black and Asian British arts, including feminist work, my friend Shia Brown. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Roshini, now it's over to you.
Sorry.
Roshini, come.
Speed through it.
Yeah, no, you've been very good on the timing. I'm very impressed.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thanks to Julian for inviting me. Forgive me if I don't refer to Stuart's writings more directly and with the care and attention it deserves. And sorry, Stuart. I just want to have some slides running in the background of my work in order to establish a relationship between my own practice since the 1990s to now as a media artist and photographer and Stuart's interest and attention to the visual. It is from making visual work that I speak from. So unlike Julian's introduction, I'm actually referring more directly to two essays in Stuart Hall's, the second volume of Identity and Diaspora, edited by David. Old and New Ethnicities from 91, and Thinking the Diaspora Home Thoughts from Abroad in 99. So it's interesting that this essay was given at the 50th anniversary of the founding, this particular one, Thinking the Diaspora, the founding of the University of the West Indies, which was in 1948. And typically, Hall noted the date coincided with the arrival of the Empire Windrush to Tilbury Docks, seen as a symbolic birth date of the Caribbean post-war Black diaspora, and incidentally my father's generation, which signalled for him, and I quote, the irresistible rise of multiracial Britain. And that's the subtitle he took from Mike and Trevor Phillips' book on the Windrush. Today, of course, it coincidentally resonates with Zach Ove's forthcoming curated exhibition and event in Somerset House, Get Up, Stand Up Now. So I think we might want to reflect on these times in that sense. So David Morley attends to the tenet of Stuart's writing in his introduction when he says, the volume represents a selection from Hall's later work as his more explicit topic questions of race, ethnicity and identity, and thus displays a shift in the focus of his analytical attention. And in particular, he notes Stuart's anti-essentialist analysis of race and ethnicity in the volume. So this volume of Stuart Hall's writing draws our attention to the impact of the Black diaspora, race, Black subject positions, and Caribbean migrations, as well as African and Asian migration, on the political, social, and cultural life of the UK since the 1950s. The analytic attention given to racialized bodies and communities Stuart evoked in the 1980s and 90s, I argue, resonates with the approach and attention urgently needed now. And this is what I wanted to register with you. So I just wanted to focus on two matters. One was around his writings that looked at terminologies that were used to explore race, Black aesthetics and representation of Blackness as Black diaspora acknowledge. And then the second was the importance and centrality of race, racism, and notions of Blackness to political projects. So Hall's essay significantly maps the erosion and displacement of the old logic of identity, and he talks a little bit about that in the first essay. He explores ways in which linguistics, psychoanalysis, and Marxism redefines the once stable language of identity, and where these disturbances in the continuity of the notion of the subject and the stability of identity was what modernity was like, as a problem or as trouble. It was Hall's interest in the significance of the symbolic and cultural imaginary to identity formations that interested me and interests me as a photographer and media artist. In the two essays alone, for example, he refers to Hanif Qureshi and Stephen Frears' film, My Beautiful Laundrette, of '85, Isaac Julian's documentary, The Darker Side of Black, Julian Henriques' film, Baby Mother, who's here with us and who's convening this event from '98, I believe. Guyanese painter Aubrey Williams' paintings and retrospective exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery that was curated by Iniva, and particularly Chilean was involved in that in '98, to explore ways in which Black aesthetics of difference and marginality were created as avant-garde projects and narratives evoking multiple locations and spaces, local and global positions, differentiated gendered relationships, and altogether more complex Black life experiences. He was exploring how and where the margins begin to speak, another way of representing, debating, and thinking about the Black diaspora. Hall's critique of Black aesthetics and representations of Blackness contained two other central questions about the photographic and filmic form, and both of these are dear to my heart. And I'll try and just touch on these briefly so I can move on. One was that he considered it he considered a weakness in relation to the social documentary approach, for its, particularly in photography, for its relationship to realism and its ability to construct a reformer's eye or look, and that's quoting Hall. In other words, he consistently warned us of the limitations of photography and film's relationship to the real and authentic truths, and this was something that we really explored during the 80s and 90s. On the other hand, was his insistence on the importance of history and rereading knowledge of past narratives to our present. And yet he warned of the difficulties in handling these explosive little documents of archive material and simply relying on reconstructing Black history from existing photographic sources. Our Black diasporic relationship to our roots and roots in both spellings holds what he considers, what he notes to be an irredeemable historical question of many people, most of whom originally belonged elsewhere. Far from having continuous pasts, our relationship to history is marked by the most horrendous, violent, abrupt, ruptural breaks. And I was quoting him from the essay. So to the present, I just wanted to register how we might move forward from his writings. In recent years, we've seen an explosion and hypervisual reach of Black culture, Black aesthetics, Black expression, not only in the UK and the US, but on a global scale. And of course, it's exciting times for us. The likes of Lubena Himid, having won the Turner Prize, David Adjaye, prestigious architectural influence is global. Frank Bowling, for example, who's currently on Tate Britain, etc. The list goes on. We've also got international recognition of Caribbean visual artists, including people like Evelyn Patterson and Chris Cozier, and of course Sheila Rose. And that doesn't even take into consideration the popularity and explosion of African American artists, visual artists, onto the arts map. So Black diasporic artists, critics, curators, and theorists are enjoying the legacies of Hall's hard work, of sophisticated reflection, and the creativity of Black aesthetics and Black visual culture. And I would argue that this is the impact of Hall's work. We also see extended theoretical frames that jostle with and sit alongside notions of representation of racialized bodies that Hall always presented and discussed. The interdisciplinary work that Hall put into play as the cultural studies project. We could have a debate right here and now about the ways in which Blackness has come to be defined since Hall's perspectives in the 1990s, and a discussion as to who is now included. We could also say something about the reassertion of the nationalist tropes, as Siva Mohan Valuvan noted in his talks, where he notes race-making was determining this current UK nationalist tendency, in which the working classes are invested with whiteness, and where racist testimonies are read as unmediated social tropes. So I fear the rise of essentialism has been an underlying tendency on all fronts, and Black visual culture has not escaped this. Is the proliferation of Black cultural expression contributing to this? Or is it part of what agenda is the proliferation of Black cultural expression contributing to? These are the questions Hall would have been asking now. In other words, why the proliferation of Black aesthetics now? Something feels not right as we struggle to make sense of this highly contested, contradictory, political, social, and cultural space. The last comment I want to make about Hall's writings I referred to here is its ongoing influence to do with the centrality of race, racism, and notions of blackness to political work and activism. As Hall notes in his essay in Old and New Identities, the formation of the black diasporas in the period and post-war migration in the 50s and 60s transformed English social, economic, and political life. On the part of the arrivals, those persons migrating the black diasporic identity formations was and still is what Hall describes as an enormous act. He talks about the effort that was made of imaginary political re-identification and re-territorialization that involved mobilizing socially, culturally, economically, and politically to resist their exclusion and their marginalization. The margins began to speak. This enormous act of activism to be included to resist marginalization became important in the anti-racist struggle of the 1970s. Migration of people from the Caribbean, East Africa, and the Asian subcontinent all identified themselves politically as black. Anti-racism in the 1970s, he comments, and I quote, was fought and resisted in the localities behind the slogan of black politics and the black experience. His own tireless efforts of activism, mobilization, resistance taught our generation that these acts were crucial to the formation of the black diaspora in Britain. His later work, as we know, was to establish and consolidate black visual arts practice into lasting legacies of project spaces, buildings, and resources. And we think about Rivington Place and the Stuart Hall Library, that many of us work towards, particularly those running involved with the work of Autograph and Iniva. Stuart recognised the need to create legacy of art institutions for the next generation and the future, and to record and present minor histories so black folk can take up their rightful place in history and society. Since then, much has changed. The conservative ideology for the arts has influenced the way in which black diaspora, as Hall observed and contributed to it, has been fragmented, privatized, and been subjected to the psychic, social, and cultural conditions of austerity and twisted conservative logic. My question is whether we have learnt enough about knowing and performing enormous acts to work within these new nationalistic and bombastic conditions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roshini. Okay, Clive Nwonka is going to come on as our last speaker, and then we'll be going into the discussion. Thank you, Clive.
Thanks. So I will be talking about Stuart's chapters, Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities, and what is the Black popular arts. I'll be very, very concise, but I want to preface my talk by referring to something that you mentioned, Roshini. Julian Henriques is his baby mother in 1998. At least one other person in this room knows his story. I first met Julian on the set of Baby Mother in the mid-90s as a 12-year-old on the Stonebridge Park estate where he was filming. Me and my 3 cousins went down to the set and tried to loiter and hustle our way into the production. I'm not going to repeat what Julian said to me as a 12-year-old then, but he came not to remember. But seeing Baby Mother being shown on Channel 4 in 1998, filmed on the Stonebridge Park estate and circulated on Channel 4 as a black film, was quite crucial to me to understanding what it meant to be represented in terms of my identity, in terms of my geographic location. And that leads nicely to my interest, excuse me, in Hall's paper, Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities. So Hall was working through what he described as the war of positions in this paper, where he was updating Gramsci to conceptualize what is Black identity, what is the Black experience, and how this singular identity is being conferred onto the Black population, and how this can be exploded, made heterogeneous, and referred to a lived experience of difference in all its modernity. But Hall recognized the challenges that are to be found in creating this new discursive space, this war of positions. As he says in the book, why is this difficult? It has no guarantees. Because identifications change and shift. They can be worked on by political and economic forces outside of us, and they can be articulated in different ways. There is absolutely no political guarantee already inscribed in identity. There is no reason on God's earth why a film is good because a black person made it. Of course, this last point was in reference to his seminal paper, New Ethnicities, which I believe was delivered in this very building in 1988 during the original Black Film British Cinema Conference, where he said, films aren't necessarily good because black people make them. They're not necessarily right on by virtue of the fact that they deal with the black experience. Once you enter the politics at the end of the essential black subject, you're plunged headlong into a maelstrom of continuously contingent, unguaranteed political argument and debate, a critical politics, a politics of criticism. What does this tell us? The answer is what you actually think a film is. And what Stuart Hall has taught me through this paper is that film, in many ways, is nothing more than light on the screen and sound coming through speakers that has no material function or existence or meaning before it's processed by an audience. And in its processing, films can be organized to engage a particular viewer, as Julian Henriques' film did for me many, many years ago. There is a scene in Steve McQueen's film Widows from last year where one of the characters, who's a preacher, says to his congregation, "What has happened to the world that normal now passes for excellence?" And in thinking through this, what a film is, what excellence is, I'm thinking through contemporary films, contemporary black films that purported to deal with the black experience. I'm thinking immediately of films such as Yardie by Idris Elba and the films of Amr Sante. Films that I feel have been problematic textually in terms of narration, but have been rescued by their supposed cultural value. But value is always political. And what happens when cultural value becomes ideological value? When it's used to advance particular agendas around what black really means. I would ask for some trepidation when we think around the application of cultural studies and thinking through these ideas. There are certain cultural studies approaches that have turned black film studies, for instance, into questions of classification as opposed to judgment or assessment or evaluation. And this can lead to a topology of relative meaning in the sense that black film means different things to different people, which could disallow or evacuate a question around their textual value. But Hall's chapter is essential and quite crucial in thinking through black films and how they've been absolutely designed and essentialized along the models he was suggesting in 1991, and functions via a black culture politics in the extensive cultural praise heaped on our films and a lack of critical thought countering the celebratory vein. Why is this? Because neoliberalism has such a dominant hold on people's lives, many people's lives, and that now very much includes black lives, blackness, black cultural products, and black representations. There are many different meanings to neoliberalism. I apply it here as a market rationality. We can liken it to the idea of racialized capital, in which white individuals and predominantly white institutions use non-white people to acquire social and economic value within a system of racial capital that displaces measures that would lead to meaningful social change. But the reason why it's been so successful is because its methods are so inconspicuous and so subtle and so sophisticated. And Stuart warned us that the hegemony is not the same as the domination. It's not as repressive. At some level, it needs the nation's consent. And in thinking through what he calls the regimes of representation, he suggests, firstly, the question of access to the right to representation by black artists and black cultural workers. Secondly, the contestation of marginality and the stereotypical quality, the fetishized nature of black images by the counterposition of a positive black imagery. Both of these questions of access and the voyeuristic nature of the images are conducive to thinking around the second chapter, which is what is the Black popular culture? Because what has happened when the tenets of the regime's representation, access, stereotypical quality, and the positive Black imagery are no longer diametrically opposed, are no longer in opposition. As Stuart says in this chapter, by definition, Black popular culture is a contradictory space. It is a site of strategic contestation, but it can never be simplified or explained in terms of the simple binary between oppositions that are still habitually used to map it out. Stuart's chapter is making me interested in the idea that neoliberalism has now given the signifier of Black access through stereotypical depictions that have somehow rendered them positive under the auspices of the ultimate neoliberal construction, post-racial cultural diversity. There are a range of examples I could use, but I want to offer a provocative point that may stimulate some discussion later, which is neoliberalism's investment in the spectacle of Black death. Cinematic depictions of Blackness have not been ignorant to the rise of neoliberalism, and we can trace the severity of the challenge neoliberalism poses in how we come to understand the Black body. A good example is Northwest, a television adaptation of Zadie Smith's best-selling book by the same name, which is a 90-minute drama for BBC Two in 2016, I believe. The power to subject another race to the will or the gaze voyeuristically is termed on the neoliberal subject, the Black criminalized youth. Black death, the lacerated Black body, is central to the drama. We have Black as both victimizer and victim. Black death is both literal in our protagonist, who is stabbed to death, and metaphor in our antagonist, in the wastefulness of Black youth existence. What we are encountering here is an excess of Black convention. And what is crucial to my argument is that Northwest was screened as part of the BBC's Black Britain season in 2016, where a range of dramas, shows and documentaries fronted by Black people will take us into a new epistemology and understanding of what it is to be Black and British today. That's a direct quote. The moment, as Stuart says, of the signifier Black is torn from its historical, cultural, and political embedding and lodged in a biologically constituted racial category, we valorize, by inversion, the very ground of the racism we are trying to deconstruct. This, for me, creates the spectacle of the Black neoliberal aesthetic, a certain vision and imagination of Black cultural life, of Black youth life, of Black death, that is interesting and voyeuristic and marketable to an audience. What is essential to the spectacle of the Black death is genre, its textual vulnerability. The surface is real and recognizable, and therefore offers a form of narrational sociology, the social real with social political critique. This, of course, also chimes with the political claim that knife and gun murders in London are no outcome of a defective socio-economic structure, but of a distinctive incubus within Black culture itself. So we have here the foregrounding of Black convention or common sense in determining a particular neoliberal aesthetic of Black reality to an already racialized audience. Here, the text actually becomes a reference to things it claims to reject, and that remains largely an endeavor of both Black and white imagination, in which social critique is subordinated to an intra-race critique of Blackness, which remains largely one-dimensional and essential in its pathos. To finish, as I'm looking at Julian, how to challenge this is much more complex, because capitalism has such a dominant hold on people's lives, but equally, neoliberalism has made modern culture so resistant to analysis and criticism more generally. You can be quite open about your criticisms, but they have no effect. So the whole idea of you can expose the mechanisms of ideology in a text, as I'm doing now, it means you're somehow breaking down or challenging them fundamentally, is much, much harder now, particularly when the text is claiming diversity, which in my opinion, the basis for the Stuart Hall approach is a radical skepticism. When Hall told us that Black films are not good films because they're Black, he was prophesizing the cosmopolitan nature of neoliberalism, which can distort inequality in its ability to recruit difference within environments of power. This is not to say there shouldn't be any attempt to balance the racial, sexual, or gender representations, but the current orthodoxy deals not with the politics of inequality, but its numbers. That simply arrange the distribution of inequality is not to alter the structure of inequality itself. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the four panelists and Dave for really engaging in such a fruitful way with the work and showing in so many different respects how we can use it to think where we are. And so before we go to questions, which we'll do in 1 or 2 minutes, I'd just like to ask if any of the panelists would like to make an immediate response to what they've heard from their fellow panelists. I mean, Dave, you've got one particular point that you'd like to... No, Dave is passing on that. Angela?
Well, I would just like to say that I think it was so interesting that both Roshini and Clive addressed the question of the current moment of diversity in inverted commas and on what Sarah Bennett-Weiser calls economies of visibility and what is at stake in the current moment of even hyper-visibility and what are the rooms for maneuver there and what are the... You both implied that in some ways this was even more constraining or more difficult than perhaps the moment that Stuart was writing about in the 80s. And so that's an interesting... you know, for me, one of the questions that I've been thinking about is, you know, how does capitalism, crudely, or neoliberalism, respond to precisely the critique of race, the new critique of race, the new critique of feminism? And in Clive's presentation, I got the sense of which, you know, the argument from Boltanski and Schiapello that, you know, these critical forces can be a source of innovation for capitalism. You know, how can it innovate through? And I've been watching adverts on TV, you know, for engagement rings, and then it turns out it's a lesbian couple. You kind of think, oh, so here's, you know, capitalism is kind of being thrown into in this kind of cultural kind of washing machine. So perhaps you might like to say a little bit more about that.
Very, very briefly. Huge question. I mean, yeah, but we do need to get to the audience in a moment or two.
Okay, I'll try the best I can. I mean, I guess when I said at the end that we need a radical skepticism is the best way of paying diligence to Hall, is really thinking about how capitalism has been able to bring the other in. And Hall's notion of incorporation is a perfect example of this, how it can actually, rather than kind of challenge the challenge, it can renovate the challenge to make it serve its own agendas. And certainly my analysis of cultural diversity, which also requires a kind of post-racialism as well, and denying thinking in racial terms, has been the ultimate success of capitalism or neoliberalism in shutting down that critique that emerged in the 80s with Stuart, Cobiner, Paul Gilroy in this very room around black arts, black film. It's placed on the margins of society. So I think skepticism is probably the best way to kind of respond to what's happening in capitalism.
Thank you, Clive. A quick comment, Roshini? No? Okay, very good. So you've all been... to be tough. So the floor is now open. This is the part of the discussion, not that we haven't enjoyed the contributions, that is a very important part of this evening. And so who's going to formulate the first question or comment or contribution in the spirit of conversation that Stuart so embodied? Yes, I see a hand there. Can we have the mic there, please? Third row back. Thank you. And the next person be formulating their question, and on go.
Hi, thank you all so much. Since it's the freshest on my mind, I wanted to talk a little bit, would like you to talk a little bit about where the digital space kind of also complicates this idea of skepticism and even being radical. And I'm referencing, you know, Black Twitter as a phenomenon, as a space for this kind of like pseudo engagement and pseudo criticism of Black content that's being circulated. If you can speak a little bit about kind of technology in the digital space.
Thank you. Okay, that was very clearly put. So who would like to respond to Roshini?
Answer quickly. Well, two things for me. One is that on the one hand, there's quite a lot of interesting studies being done around the idea of algorithms and race, which I think has been really important to kind of follow as in relation to surveillance, in relation to the construction of raciality in the data process. And so we need to be very mindful of that. And on the other hand, I think that that space of digital technology for me is also the space of resistance, of collective thought, of possible kind of dialogue that we can take up and make use of. It cannot be a substitute, however, to infrastructure. And to buildings and to spaces where we can talk and places that I think, you know, Stuart was very adamant about us having in the here and now on the ground and physically. So to me, it's an additional kind of complementary space that we're inhabiting now that I think is absolutely crucial to maintain dialogue and to maintain a kind of a collective notion of Blackness and creativity.
Thank you. Anybody else on that one? No, but yes, just to amplify what you were saying, Roshini, in terms of the pressure on public space and the lack of spaces for having these kind of discussions is very acute at the moment. Who's got the next question, please? There's a hand right there, fifth row. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to bring up a point from Stuart Hall in response to your point about skepticism. I read a chapter from him when he talked about defetishization and defamiliarization of Blackness and difference in general, when he says that a useful strategy for the way capitalism introduces difference in culture is to show how Blackness can be ambiguous in many different ways. So talk about humor, or talk about eroticism, or like ways of transcending the narrative that Black people are sort of only trapped in political struggle, and that's sort of the essence of their existence. And I just wanted to ask you how you would respond to that. And whether you could sort of highlight other ways of defamiliarizing Blackness and difference more broadly.
So, Clive,
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting question. So when you say defamiliarization, I guess you are talking around the demarking of race in text, be it film or TV or other kind of forms of popular culture. That should be the ambition. The problem, again, is neoliberalism. So cultural diversity requires Blackness to be marked, requires it to be evident to justify funding, to justify some kind of social engagement with society. So what we have is a situation where the ambitions that you have, and I think everyone shares it as well, is trapped in a dialect between notions of post-racialism and diversity as a form of governance as well. So again, we come back to skepticism, is thinking around the economic system and how Blackness has been made commodified in recent years. It needs to be marked to be justified sometimes, which makes it very, very difficult for it to be demarked in the ways that you're proposing.
Thank you. Thank you. And the next one, next question. I can't see a hand. Do I need to say? Yes, right at the back, third row from the back. Thank you.
Hi. this is a message for Clive or any of the panels. Based on your skepticism, what do you think is the best way forward? I mean, it's easy to talk about it.
Just another small question.
I mean, because you mentioned several films, like your Stephen Queen, Baby Father, etc., and productions on BBC. Yeah, you have people who are publishing their own stuff as well, which they create their own dialogue, which is not mainly mainstream. Yeah, so then your notion of skepticism is a kind of flaw from my perspective. You know, so how do you propose another dialogue based on that?
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, so you're asking that skepticism isn't conducive if the ambition is to produce things in the mainstream, is that correct? Yeah,
It's very difficult. Yeah, I think you assume that is correct because we're
Okay. Now, what I'm saying is, right, I see a lot of productions, yeah? So I'm talking not just in the UK, Europe, Africa, Eastern Europe, yeah?
Yeah.
You got filmmakers doing the black aesthetic, etc., etc. The way they promote their products is a bit different from the UK. Some of it doesn't enter the UK. Yeah, you may see it at the BFI Film Festival, and that's it, yeah? Or you may see it at Cannes, etc., etc. Yeah. So in terms of skepticism, how do we in the UK address that? Because Europe seems to be having their own dialogue, and in the UK we seem to be in the here and now situation.
Okay, I understand you. I think it's definitely true that Europe, Africa, America is a different production context. I think with UK, it's a reliance on public funding. That is one of the kind of biggest issues here. It's very, very difficult for practitioners, visual agents, to have an autonomous mode of production with the reliance on public funding, as you can contest as well as an artist. So for that reason, if your product is being made under the auspices of inclusion or diversity, we must at some level question ethics for a second. Because I think outcomes are one thing, but motivation is another. And often we haven't stopped to think about the motivations for cultural institutions in their investment in black cultural products. I think once we do those, it then becomes a value judgment whether you're happy with the ethics involved. I've never been an artist or filmmaker, so I can't comment on in terms of how I feel about being funded to make a film under the auspices of my race. But I recognise that people who have been on the outside of the mainstream for many, many years, and who see these windows of opportunity is quite crucial to their survival. I mean, thinking beyond artistic practice, we talk about survival in terms of an economic survival as well. Having said that, I do think there should be some kind of critical questioning about the operations of institutions, BFI, ITA, BBC, about why they're suddenly in recent years become invested and interested in blackness. It can't be altruistic because it would happen much longer. So what is the motivation here? Is it the quantification of race? Is it the recognition of racial inequality in the UK? Those haven't been articulated in those ways. If you read any kind of policy document, we're still under the understanding of underrepresentation as some kind of thing that just occurs haphazardly. It happens because people are excluded on basis of identity. And until organisations are willing to be open about how they're complicit in those things, we do need the radical skepticism, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Last Okay, who's next? Perhaps we can broaden the discussion a little bit. And because the conditions, the conjuncture that we're in is obviously we're getting the symptoms here, which we've been talking about, and the strategies with regard to that. But we've got a bigger arena that we're operating in, that we're subject to globally, and so certainly economically. So perhaps there's some thoughts in the mind. Yes, I see a hand there. Yep, right at the back. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming in today. My question, I know we've been talking a lot about Black art as kind of a filtered means of Black aesthetic, but I'm wondering, kind of as we touched upon it before, but the idea of the unfiltered Black aesthetic in terms of social media, in terms of the mass amount of just kind of non-art Blackness, and kind of how does that enter the world of vernacular and how Black culture is seen through unfiltered mediums such as social media.
Okay. Angela, did you pick up the mic?
Well, yes. Thank you for that question. I think it's very interesting to connects with the first question about social media. I think the emergence of zines and, for example, Black girls magazines like Gal Dem and Missy magazine in Berlin. There's a whole range of kind of expressions of presence and critique that are proliferating across the world of social media and that have got a strong kind of, in every way, a kind of unrelenting political anger as well. So those expressions, I think, do come into the notion of a revived popular aesthetics. And when I was thinking about vernacular in relation to Stuarts, and I'm kind of troubled also by the idea of tradition. I think underlying these two articles by Stuart is this kind of deep sense of anxiety about race and class, actually. But when I was thinking about vernacular, I was thinking that running through the two articles by Stuart, there's a kind of presence of youth subcultures, and that instead of kind of that they might now be our tradition. Tradition needn't be something kind of archaic and in the Raymond Williams past, but the popular vernacular of rock against racism, or the punk and reggae mix, or the particularly post-punk culture. I'm now recently been thinking about how punk and post-punk culture were kind of so energetic and so enabling, if you like, and really parallel to the work of the artists. So that's one answer to that question. But then I also think a little bit in relation to what Clive was talking about, is how has neoliberalism impacted on the field of Black cultural production? And obviously there are quite a lot of sociologists. My colleague Anna McSaha has been working extensively on this, but there's also the extent to which it's the institutions that I think we need to look at, how the institutions have been neoliberalized, driven by metrics, driven by data, driven by tick the box, and how then questions of race and sexuality and gender are kind of forced into those matrices of data, really. And very interesting question, how does that then refract on this new subjectivities, the new artists and producers, or the people entering into this field of seemingly, well, you could hardly call it generous, but you could say that there are perhaps, after a long period of closure, because the moment of the Isaac Julian and the moment that Steve McQueen and Charlotte Berman kind of entered into the stage, and you too, I'm also sure, Roshini, was a moment of state-funded possibilities, access courses, no fees at university. There were kind of mechanisms and avenues that were beneficial to disadvantaged students and artists, and that was then shut down. So what's opened up now is deeply, I'm sure Stuart would say, it's deeply problematic. Sorry, it's a long answer to your question.
It's very, very, very helpful, very, very useful. Thank you, Angela. Yes, I can see a face I recognise there, Bill Schwartz. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. This question is kind of for Angela, but if anyone's got an answer, please, anyone could respond, please. You talked about authoritarian populism, Angela, and in some ways, for goodness sake, we really need to know about authoritarian populism, because it's now manifest in forms which Stuart Hall could have never imagined. That concept is 30 years old. So my question to anyone is, how do we use that concept now? How do you use a concept of 30 years ago to try to get to grips with the current conjuncture?
Anything else like to only going to
I don't know. I just because that it's old, or you're looking for for a typology of authoritarian populisms, or what doesn't work about authoritarian populism now, which did work better at a certain point 30 years ago?
Oh, I mean, I don't know if it's the answer to that, but one way of responding to your question, I think what is happening to the political field now is almost like the incipient erosion of what politics is, or what politics used to be. So the political field, in a sense, doesn't exist as it did 30 years ago. It doesn't exist as it did 10 years ago. You know, Trumpian populism is actually disassembling the political field. The enemy becomes an enemy, not with whom you can negotiate, but with whom you eliminate. Hannah Arendt, famously in The Origins of Totalitarianism, talks about fascism not as politicizing everything, but as a mode to depoliticize the world. And I have a feeling that is, perhaps one way of understanding what is happening now, that the political field itself is being eroded and broken. How then do we imagine a politics in which the formal political world is no longer there, or no longer what it was?
The person who's come closest to it in my recent experience was a couple of nights ago on Channel 4 News. Arundhati Roy was asked about Trump, and I thought her line was very good: to stop talking about Trump, stop taking the mickey out of his haircut, stop taking the mickey out of the fact that he can't spell, and talk about the policies. What does it mean for the NHS? What does that mean in relation to the remnants of the welfare state, such as they are? I think there's certainly a rhetoric against the forms of authoritarian populism that he represents, which is entirely self-defeating, because the more you make fun of those people, the more they can present themselves. Oh yeah, the sophisticatedly being prejudiced and snobby again. There's the language of how we address that has yet to be formulated. But it was just her manner, Arundhati Roy's manner in trying to get at it, was just to try and stay very sensible. To think, well, what is at stake, and what is this so-called deal that Mr. Trump is offering? What are the it just sort of deflate it a little. That's not an answer, but
no, but perhaps we're getting there a little bit, Angela.
Well, I think that there is a need for, of course, a conjunctural analysis of now. That would seem of Rees-Mogg, of Boris, of the new forms of populism, and of what Wendy Brown calls apocalyptic populism. So I think we just have to do that work and kind of hold tight and hold the ground. But I also, as I kind of suggested in what I said, is that I think maybe we have to critique populism and find other ways of reinventing popular radical democracy. And that's why I kind of emphasize vernacular elements. That is to say, elements that need not always be, if you like, elevated to the level of the political, but which can be worked at and through at cultural levels. And I think that is a kind of resource of hope. And then the third point I would make, which I'm sure is probably quite unpopular, but the Brazilian philosopher in Open Democracy a couple of days ago, I've forgotten his name, talked about new forms of pluralism. So I think instead of populism, if you like, fragmented political formations that would fill this centre ground as well, because I was really taken by Stuart's notion. It's a bit parallel to Hannah Arendt's depoliticising, but the evacuation of the centre ground seemed to me like a mechanism, a profound mechanism, a Bannon-type mechanism, actually, that has got to be. So even if it is, you know, the Lib Dems or, you know, new political form, I think that's where I would position myself as having some hope to avoid catastrophe.
Thank you.
I
Roshini?
was just going to pick up on the question, the previous question as well, because I think all of what Angela has suggested in terms of what we might do, but we also, I mean, Stuart would probably remind us about thinking very carefully and listening very carefully to younger vernacular expressions that you mentioned, Angela, in a way, the Caldem, skin deep, you know, these are places of a kind of an expression of hope on the one hand, of possible collective kind of spirit on the other hand, and then we also have, you know, very young people talking about the environment in a very positive and a very constructive way that we might need to take note of. So for me, listening to that is very carefully is what we also need to be doing, and that the institutions need to be responding to that more better. You know, that there is a way that that debate needs to be had within the institutions, you know, and the institutions need to open up to that kind of debate and the type of work that's being produced.
Thank you very much, Roshini. Thank you, Bill, as well. And right there, and Jeff in the same row.
Yes, just a couple of short points on authoritarian populism. I think, for me, by definition, populism has to be authoritarian. I mean, empirically, if you look around, that combination is there. And I think it's always there because it is built upon common sense. And to impose common sense, you have to have that authoritarian dimension. Actually, to go back to Bill's point about politics, what we need to be doing, the second issue, is to transform common sense into good sense. And that's the big task in relation to all these areas around race and immigration. What is the good sense on these? We know what the common sense is. So just the 2 points, that populism is, I think, inevitably authoritarian, so it makes it a bit oxymoronic to talk about authoritarian populism. But the importance of going from common sense to good sense.
Anybody? I think, yeah, thank you for that. I think we're going to disagree with that. Perhaps we can take it on with another contribution, another question. Got a few minutes more. Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, you'll be next. The mic's up there, and you'll be next. Shannon.
Thank you very much. So you spoke about a magazine like Garden Magazine, and then we've spoken about maybe more in terms of films, like the industry and how it's hard to get into that, and maybe in getting into that you have to speak about certain things or you have to deliver a certain message. And I saw like a tweet about someone who speaks about lots of different things but was only engaged with by the BBC in their own criticism of their experience as a Muslim woman. And how do you think that you can deal with that kind of, I guess, like, it's not necessarily tokenistic, but that kind of introduction into the spaces that maybe these voices, such as the writers at Galdem, the kind of places they need to speak at. How can you get into those spaces when those spaces have certain requirements which are necessarily negative to the thing that you're trying to push forward?
Yes, please. Go on,
you kind of, there needs to be a very thorough critique of them, it seems to me. So that intervention still needs to be made, but build alternatives. You know, you got to get other spaces and other screenings and other spaces of debate and discussion. You know, to absolutely make that intervention to something like the BBC. The BBC is not talking to us anymore, right? It's an ideological drive that's being made, and a very conservative one. So we, to me, I'm completely alienated from that kind of type of broadcasting process because it isn't helpful at the moment. It is towing a line, and it's actually completely conservative in its outlook. So there has to be interventions to that. And there are some interesting ways in which that is happening. I think that there people are articulating signs of protest in those spaces as well. But I think we have to build alternative spaces. We have to have alternative voices. We did that in the 80s and 90s, and it's got to happen again, right?
And there's a question, Shana. You're, yeah, wait for the mic, please.
I don't really like mics. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Well, I've got a bit of a cracky voice as well. Hello. Yeah. Oh God. I don't quite sure what exactly want to say because I could go on for hours. But I think that everything everybody's been saying is absolutely fascinating. I think I just wanted to say that me personally, because Stuart Hall was always behind the work I was doing in my visual art practice, I kind of feel like we need, I miss him because there isn't really anybody else who's so much talking about, all this stuff that's going on at the moment. Because, all these art institutions, all these, we've got Get Up and Stand Up next week. We've got Faith Ringgold, The Serpentine tonight. We've got the launch of the publication for The Places here at Nottingham Contemporary tomorrow. I mean, there's something nearly every night, how are we supposed to go to these? How are we supposed to find the money? How are we supposed to find the time? How am I supposed to stay in my studio and make all this work that the forces out there expect of us when they don't even give us any money? There isn't any money out there. And then they're all having all these shows because, the Arts Council aren't doing very much. I've listed them, the Liverhume, the Wellcome Trust, God knows, and then how do we navigate the commercial world? Because that's another category, that's a mafia that's running that, so what the hell do we do? I mean, it's ridiculous. So we need more forums like this, but how do we find the time to go to them? And they cost a lot. I think mine free.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Anybody want to follow that? No, I mean, that was a contribution, and it expresses a reality which is very different from the reality that Stuart was having to deal with, and that was only since 5 years ago, 2014, wasn't it?
But if I can just respond quickly, I mean, what it really pinpoints is the question of the economy of the Black arts and the personal economies of Black and British Asian artists, and how there has been no research really done substantially. The AHRC are just picking up on some of these issues now, but there hasn't been no kind of longer historical account of what happened after the closing down of the kind of Channel 4 avenues for, there just hasn't been that kind of substantial, never mind actually looking at how do artists earn a living today and what are the kind of longer term, reliance in the past on welfare. Well, who can live in nobody can live in welfare now. So, I mean, I think that's one answer to your question, Shaila.
I just want to go back to something Roshini said earlier, which is a lot of debate has been about funding for production, for new work, new production. But the reference Roshini made to kind of alternative networks seems to be terribly important. I put my mind back to the kind of 1980s when print was the medium, when things grew up. There were alternative bookshops got established. There was a network of them. Then somebody realised that distribution was actually the issue, and the publications distribution cooperatives were formed, and you began to get a viable system of getting things around. But I sort of think maybe it's a moment at which we do have to think more about questions of distribution than a funding.
Thank you. We've got time for one or two last questions if they're pressing. Right? No? Nobody else? No. What? Right here. Where? I've got it right there. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for doing this talk. It's very interesting. I've got a bit of a sort of dilemma that I feel like a lot of maybe people my age who have just sort of started like breaking into or like exploring and taking part in sort of in prestigious institutions, organisations like the art and film sort of world or bubble, or whatever you want to call it. But I was just wondering, Roshini, you were talking about like taking up space. So what do you do when it's like, is it a matter of like, do you boycott these spaces that are now like sort of profiting on the diversity element, or do you push that further? Because it's quite exhausting to like sometimes be constantly taking up this space for us. Do you just completely? I'm getting like tongue-tied, but I don't know if that makes any sense. But I just feel like it's a constant dilemma because it's like, oh, this is a really prestigious organisation, this is a great opportunity, but then like, and then also wanting to make money and like all of these complicated things, but then I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I hear what you're saying. That's exhausting work, I think. It is. I mean, the thing about the 80s and 90s, it seems to me, was that we were also doing juggling in a slightly different way and with less pressures. That same issue of, you know, whether you go into the kind of the more mainstream kind of spaces in order to make intervention, or whether you have to take time out, come out of the space and reformulate in a way amongst your own group, which I think is always so for me it's about doing both, but actually it's about knowing when you have the energy to kind of fluctuate between those, and there's certain times of when there's blockages to the point of where it seems to me there's no point in going into the BBC in that way, because we've been there before, you know, nothing's happened, and so therefore you beat a retreat and you regroup somewhere else and you reformulate. So there isn't an answer to that. It's about your own kind of levels of energies, and to me it's also about the urgent need in this time when we have to be completely self-serving in every aspect of our lives, that actually it's about a concerted effort. So the more you're with other people who can do things and support that process, it seems to me is really important, really key to it.
Thank you, yes. So that was the message of getting together and being collected. And there's one question there that's probably going to be the last one. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to respond to that a bit more, one of the things that I've observed and have written about is the idea of an artist making a deserve rather than making an oeuvre. So a deserve.
Deserve.
Yeah.
Deserve.
So it's dissing the oeuvre, but it's also recognizing that unless you happen to be extremely privileged, whether you were working now or whether you're working in the past, you were excluded. You always had to work socially and institutionally, as well as making what you might have seen as a separate practice. And what I've argued in the concept of the deserve is actually that you regularly make your practice through institutions as well as through what you might consider to be your exhibitionary practice, let's say. And that one of the things that's useful to do, and I can only say I've done this in retrospect, is to actually anticipate and understand that this is what you'll be doing and take a very assertive, let's say, and potentially collective approach to working in institutions in this way.
Excellent.
There's also some very interesting examples of artists who are actually very aware of the limitations of the institution and taking that and incorporating it into their practice as well, in terms of how they engage, the level of engagement, and what the ambition is for their art form in those spaces, which I think is really exciting, actually.
Okay, and I'm afraid we're going to have to close it there. So I'd just like to thank our panelists, Clive, Roshini, Angela and Dave very much, and I'd like to thank you for your questions and your participation. Thanks. And just to say, these conversations are the kinds of one of the things that the Stuart Hall Foundation enjoys to do. And if you want to help us and support us in that, there, as they say, pledge forms outside on your way out. Thank you very much.